This is TWiT.
You ready?
I am.
You saw the name already, so you know it's a weird one.
I feel like we're doing this is like the S week.
Well, there's a couple of reasons why I went with Hatozaki. I mean, one of the things is I've been promising to do more Japanese full on. And since we already talked about Nikkei and Yamazaki, which are the big old guys, I felt like I was okay with going into some of the littler ones. And this is one of those. Although, as is typical, the story has taken many turns and twists, some of which I am not happy about now that I've gone down the path. But you find these things out towards the end of the research, right? I mean, in some ways, you're going to learn a little bit about how I build these stories in the first place. So I found a bottle of Hatozaki at my local distributor and grabbed it because fun. And then you start doing the research. So I learned about the Yonezawa family. So the Yonezawa family have been making sake since 1856. So, and it's named the Akashi Sake Brewery because it's in Akashi, which is in the Hyogo Prefect, which is the southern part of Japan, just east or just west of Kobe and Osaka, right on the Osaka Bay. And in 1918, they started doing distillation, but of course that would be shoju, right? They weren't worried about whiskey. So, and the shoju distillery is called Kyoki, which is the name of the bridge that connects Kyoki and Asahi, remarkably named the Asahi Kyoki Bridge. So that's Osaka Bay. That's where they are. Family-run business. The fourth generation, which is Kimio Yonezawa, now runs it. And when Yamazaki goes big and we have and we get lost in translation and it's Suntory time, all that stuff happens. All of these distillers are like, geez, we should sort of get in on this. But Kimio was clever because what he did was say, I know nothing about whiskey. I'm going to Scotland. And ends up getting tied in with an organization called Marussia, the Marussia Beverage Company. And they own Torbheg, which is the second distillery on the Isle of Skye, the first being Talisker, last week's whiskey. Now, this is where the story, I dug into Marussia at the end of my research. I'd already figured out the whiskey and all these other things, but as I dug into the company, and then I got a little squeamish because it's owned by the Paulson Company, or the Paulson family. So this is a Swedish family that made their fortune in pharmaceuticals, an organization called Ferring Pharmaceuticals. And the dad, the guy who runs the whole show, is now a big billionaire and a philanthropist. They moved to Switzerland. They're in Lausanne. He's famous as an adventurer for being the first person to have visited all 8 poles of inaccessibility in the world. I bet you've never heard of the 8 poles of inaccessibility. It's just a sort of thing a billionaire adventure comes up with. So these are the 8 sort of most inaccessible locations on the different continents. So in North America, it's like a place in South Dakota. In South America, it's in central Brazil. In Africa, it's in the central.
It's not inaccessible. It's just that nobody wants to go there.
They're pretty hard to get to.
They call it Sturgis. Yeah.
And then, of course, the hairy obvious ones are things like Antarctica. There's a location. It's not actually on the geographic pole, but it's the most inaccessible part. The Russians got there first, and he's been there. And in the Arctic, he actually went to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean and in a submersible to get to the location that was the most inaccessible. Although at the time, I remember this in the news, they put down a Russian flag down there, which for a Canadian is like pretty damn offensive. We are actually the guardians of the Arctic, for crying out loud. Right. And then there's one other spot called Point Nemo, which I know from the space industry. It's the place where you drop off your spacecraft. So that's where Mir crashed into, and it's in the South Pacific, and it's the point in the ocean furthest from any landmass. So that's where the International Space Station is supposed to end up and so forth. But the Russia tie is a thing because apparently Paulson is good friends with Putin to the point where he's literally an honorary consul to Russia in Switzerland. So he's built a bit of a mini Diageo, or a sort of conglomerate of alcohols, and he owns a bunch of whiskeys. One of them is Watershed Bourbon, which is American. The other one is the Hatozaki. That's the one we're going to talk about. Also, Clontakilty, you may remember. And
My new
Torabheg.
personal favorite, but now that I know it's a Putin affiliate, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm a little disturbed by this,
I'm
right?
not sure I want to drink it anymore.
And Torabheg, which is the sky. Mossburn is a Swedish whiskey, and Castile Chemise, which is a blending. They also make a bunch of vodkas, including some Russia vodkas you cannot buy because war. Gin, rum, brandy, cognac, Armagnac, absinthe, liqueurs. They bought a group of different entities. So, there's our digression. Kimio worked closely with Torabheg to actually learn a bit about making whiskey, to the point where they got the license in 2017. They immediately bought a set of stills from Forsyth of Roth, which is one of the best still makers in the world in Scotland. So they got a 3,500 liter wash still and a 2,200 liter spirit still. Those are small stills by anybody's measure. And now set about making whiskey. And we've talked about this before. Now you're in this challenge of making whiskey late in the game. It's 2017. When are you going to have product to sell? And generally speaking, you need at least 3 years of aging, which is for the most part what they've done. But you're now tied in with Russia, so you have access to other things. And that's where we get Hatozaki Small Batch. So this is not just Japanese whiskey. This is what's called a vatted malt. So it's only malt whiskey. No, this is not a blend per se. There's no neutral spirit in this. It's all whiskey, but it has both bourbon and Scottish whiskeys in it, and which means it's a little watershed bourbon and a little Torabheg and a bunch of their own 3-year-old. And the barreling makes sense. It's aged in bourbon casks and sherry casks and Mizunara cask, which we talked about before. That's the Japanese oak that's very difficult to make barrels from. 5 to 6 years of aging. Again, that would speak to bourbon because that's a typical aging time for bourbon. But the batches are really small. They only use about 20 barrels total for a given batch. So maybe 6,000 bottles, of which this is one of. See how pale this is. Which speaks to how young it is, and also the fact that they do no coloring or chill filtration, and it's bottled at 46%. So I've gotten into a habit now when I'm home and I get an opportunity to get a bottle of whiskey that I'm going to put on the show, that I get a few days to sort of live with it. So I've been drinking this in the evenings while writing. It's nice and floral up front. There's a nice nose on it, a little bit of alcohol scent, and you can smell the grain, which surprises me. That's almost certainly the Japanese component in it, because you wouldn't notice that so much in a bourbon or much less a Scottish whiskey. Still plenty of heat. It's inoffensive, right? Like it's so drinkable.
That's not what I'm looking for in a whiskey, really.
What is this? A comfortable drink? It's something I'm sipping on while I'm doing my thing. It's not, I had the Bowmore 15 sitting beside me a while back when I did the Bowmore piece. And each time I went to pick up the Bowmore, it's like, here comes the Bowmore.
Well, that's true, right?
Yeah. Like that. And that, so you got to kind of figure, where am I? Am I about drinking the whiskey, or am I having a drink while I'm doing something else? This is a having a drink while doing something else kind of drink.
All right.
It never interrupts you. So here's the crazy part. Hatozaki, they're only making about 250,000 bottles a year. Any given batch like this, the small batch, which I quite like, is maybe 6,000 bottles, if you can find them. They did not initially sell in Japan. Their initial releases were purely abroad, although they're selling in Japan now. You can find a bottle of this, but it won an award this year, the gold medal in the Asian Spirits Masters Award. I don't know how credible that award is. So the price is all over the map. I picked this up for about $60, and I still see a few places online where it's there, but I've seen it as high as $140. At $60, you can buy one of these and you may not get another. But don't pay much more. It's not that impressive a whiskey. It's a very young, new distillery, fallen in with an interesting organization that I would question, that's doing their best to try and make an interesting product. In 10, 15 years from now, who knows what they'll be making. But at the moment, they're doing what small distilleries do, which is that they're trying to make something interesting. By involving other entities and building vatted whiskeys and those other approaches. this is not the only way that a small distillery could work. We've talked about some other small distilleries where they deliberately use small barrels. Like if you're going to only make 6,000 bottles of something, you don't need 250 liter barrels. Like you could be using 50 liter barrels and increasing the wood coverage and getting more flavor in less amount of time. So they've chosen a particular path, and I understand it. It's one of the ways to get started. And I think it's something we're going to encounter as we go into how these new whiskey makers and the number of the options that are out there, that this is what's going to happen. I'm probably not going to buy another bottle of this, but it's another, it speaks to there's more Japanese whiskeys coming. This is one of them. They've only had a few years, and it's what you're going to get for a young distillery.
This is good though. I mean, I'm glad to know that you don't only review whiskeys that you like. That sometimes it's not that you dislike it, but there's
the bigger sin here is meh, right? It's like
yeah, that's a big sin.
Yeah, like if you elicit emotion, well, and this was my problem was that when it was $60, fine, but because it's now won an award, people are jacking the price up. Yeah. I think on Total Wine, I checked it earlier, it was $125.
Yeah, not for meh.
Don't pay that.
Not for
don't.
meh.
You know what you can get for $125? Dalmore 12, man. Like you can be drinking perfect golden caramel. Like why? If you're going to spend that kind of money, like really, but for 60 for something
great about
unusual.
You're not a snob, Richard. You'd say it's good or not, whether it's $120 or not. I like that.
Yeah, at 100, at 60, it's worth sharing. Hey, try this. It's a new Japanese whiskey.
Right.
At 120, dude, you spent a lot on a weird whiskey. Like we could be drinking Dalmore.
Are you aging that?
Yeah.
Well, I think whiskey is probably a lot like wine, that there's a lot of snob appeal and label.
I like being knowledgeable. I don't like being pretentious.
Yeah.
Because because I want to dig into the knowledgeable crowd, I end up around pretentious people, and I like him, and that does make me enjoy embarrassing them. I am. Paul's seen this. If you wind me up, like I have made sommeliers cry.
Oh,
right? Well, because don't make me weaponize the encyclopedic memory. Like it can be very mean.
I love it.
But I've also gone down the path where I looked at a wine list. This is a sort of famous story within certain circles where we're at a party of like 20 people. So will you pick wine for us? And so I'm going to build a narrative. And I realized there's like, for some reason they bought wine from Bordeaux, but the three wineries are beside each other. That's really interesting. Let's get one of each. That made the chef come down to figure out who the hell I was.
Yeah, why?
Right.
Like he's like, why did you know that? And and you got them in order. I thought we should go south to north because of the way the river flows. And he's like,
show off.
He then went to his private collection and we drank wine together.
That's when you get the good stuff.
Well, that's the thing.
You go.
If you care,
if you have
enough,
the palate,
then the other people that care appear. And I want people who care. I don't like the snobbery. I care how this thing was made. Like what did I dig into? How did they figure out how to make whiskey? Like that's interesting to me. The fact that they fell in with a Russian sympathizer is a shame, but it is what it is.
Right.
Mr. Richard Campbell, runasradio.com is the website. .net Rocks lives there as well. Sure, he named a podcast beginning with .dot.
Yeah.
What about it? What of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And to be clear, it's a dot.
It's a dot.